In the heart of Dandeli Market, where the air was always filled with the smell of fresh spices, roasted corn, and the sounds of traders calling out their prices, Alhaji Yahaya's stall stood tall and proud. His stall was always filled with the juiciest, reddest pieces of meat, stacked high on wooden slabs. People would line up every morning, eager to buy from him. It didn't matter if there were other meat sellers just a few feet away, everyone trusted Alhaji Yahaya. His meat was always fresh, his scales never cheated, and his smile never faded. He was a kind man, respected by everyone in the market, and even though others tried to match his prices, it was no use. No one could beat him. The other butchers, who struggled daily to sell even a quarter of what Alhaji Yahaya did, couldn't understand it. How was he always so successful? How did his customers never stop coming, even on the days when the market was slow? They whispered amongst themselves, their jealousy growing stronger with each passing day. The whispers turned to gossip, and soon, the other meat sellers began to hatch a plan. One of the meat sellers, Maulam Musa, decided to take matters into his own hands. He was tired of watching Alhaji Yahaya succeed while his own business crumbled. He watched Alhaji Yahaya closely, noticing how he always arrived earlier than anyone else and left much later. There was something strange about the way he moved, the way his eyes glinted when no one was looking. Maulam Musa knew that something was not right, and he was determined to find out what it was. One night, after the market had emptied and the lamps were dimming, Maulam Musa followed Alhaji Yahaya to the outskirts of the market, where the light of the moon barely touched the ground. Hidden behind an old tree, Musa watched in silence as Alhaji Yahaya disappeared into the darkness. What he saw next shook him to his core. Yahaya was not just a simple meat seller, he was doing something else, something that no one would ever believe. Musa's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what he had just witnessed. The next day, Maulam Musa was filled with a dangerous thought. He could use this knowledge to ruin Yahaya, but what would the cost be? Maulam Musa couldn't shake the image from his mind. All night, he tossed and turned, replaying what he had seen. There was Alhaji Yahaya, standing in a small clearing, surrounded by objects that Musa didn't recognize, strange symbols drawn on the ground, bowls of mysterious liquids, and the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. Yahaya had been murmuring words, almost like a prayer, but they weren't any prayers Musa had ever heard. As the smoke curled into the night sky, it was clear that this was no ordinary ritual. The next morning, Musa's hands trembled as he stood at his own stall, watching Yahaya set up like nothing had happened. His usual customers, mostly children and women from the nearby villages, laughed and chatted with him as they handed over their coins. The sight made Musa's stomach twist with anger. He knew he couldn't just let this go. He had to do something, but what? If he told the other sellers, would they even believe him? Or would they accuse him of being jealous, of making up stories just to ruin Yahaya's reputation? But the more he thought about it, the more an idea began to form in his mind. If he couldn't defeat Yahaya by selling better meat, maybe he could use what he knew to destroy him. If the people found out that Alhaji Yahaya wasn't as innocent as he seemed, that his success came from strange and dark practices, they'd never buy from him again. They'd be terrified, disgusted, and Yahaya would be ruined. Later that day, Musa waited until the market was quieter. He approached two of the other butchers, Kura and Sani, who were busy sharpening their knives. "There's something you should know about Yahaya," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Something dark." Kura raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about, Musa?" "Yahaya is just a lucky man, that's all." Musa leaned closer, making sure no one else could hear. "It's not luck. I followed him last night. I saw what he does after the market closes. He performs rituals. Sacrifices. That's why his stall is always full, why people never stop buying from him. He's using something else, something not from this world." The other two men exchanged nervous glances. "Sacrifices?" Sonny asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You can't be serious. I'm telling you the truth." Musa's eyes widened with the intensity of his words. "If we don't do something, we'll all be out of business. The whole market will be cursed by his actions. People need to know the truth." Kura and Sonny hesitated, fear creeping into their expressions. But there was something else too, curiosity. Could what Musa was saying be true? If it was, they stood to gain from it. If Yahaya's secret was exposed, his customers would flee to them instead. Slowly, they nodded. "All right," Kura finally said. "But how do we prove it?" Musa smiled darkly. "Leave that to me." The next night, as the market once again emptied and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Musa crept to the same spot where he had hidden before. This time, he wasn't alone. Kira and Sonny followed closely behind, their faces pale with anticipation. They crouched behind the same tree, watching as Yahaya once again moved through the shadows to the clearing. As the strange ritual began, Musa felt his heartbeat quicken. This was it. This was the proof they needed. But something was different this time. The air felt heavier, thicker. The flames of Yahaya's candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the ground. As Yahaya muttered his incantations, the wind began to howl, and the trees seemed to bend toward them, as if something unseen had taken notice of their presence. Suddenly, Yahaya's head snapped up, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He looked directly toward their hiding spot. Musa's blood ran cold. Could Yahaya see them? How had he known they were there? The three men froze, too afraid to move. Yahaya stood still for a moment, then turned back to his ritual. But Musa knew something had changed. Yahaya was aware of them now. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. As the wind picked up, swirling the dust around them, Musa's heart pounded harder than ever. He could barely breathe, certain that Alhaji Yahaya had seen them. His mouth went dry as the night felt darker, heavier. Kira and Sonny, crouched next to him, exchanged anxious glances. They were now trapped in their own game, and it was too late to back out. Yahaya continued with his ritual, but something about his movements had changed. He seemed more deliberate, his hands moving slower, his voice carrying a weight that wasn't there before. His words, those strange, foreign words, cut through the night like a blade. Musa couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone anymore. It was as if the air itself was watching them, pressing down on them. Kira tugged at his sleeve, whispering, "We need to go. Now." But Musa shook his head. They had come this far. They needed to see it through. Then, without warning, the wind stopped. The night went completely still, like the world was holding its breath. Yahaya stood straight, his eyes now glowing brighter, unnatural and terrifying. He raised his hands, palms facing the sky, and whispered something that Musa couldn't quite hear, but he felt it, deep in his bones. In a flash, Yahaya moved with startling speed, racing toward the sound. Musa and Sonny were left behind, shocked. The two of them exchanged a terrified look. "We have to go," Sonny whispered urgently, his voice barely holding together. But Musa shook his head. "Not yet. If we run now, he'll know everything. We can't leave proof." Sonny stared at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You want to stay after all of that? Are you mad?" "I'm not staying here another second." And with that, Sonny took off in the opposite direction, disappearing into the night. Musa stood alone, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Yahaya had gone after Kira, but for how long? He had only seconds to make a decision. Should he run now and abandon everything? Or should he stay and finish what he started? But just as he was about to move, the sound of footsteps came from behind. Musa turned slowly, his stomach dropping. Alhaji Yahaya emerged from the shadows, his glowing eyes locking onto Musa with a calm, knowing expression. "You shouldn't have come here," Yahaya said, his voice quiet but filled with power. "There are things you don't understand, things you should never have seen." Musa opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to find a way out, but the look in Yahaya's eyes told him it was too late. Yahaya stepped closer, his presence looming. "You thought you could ruin me? That you could steal my success by exposing what you don't understand?" He shook his head slowly. "You have no idea what you've done." Musa's throat tightened as the reality of his situation settled in. Yahaya wasn't just a butcher. He was something else entirely. Something more dangerous than Musa could have ever imagined. Yahaya leaned in, his eyes boring into Musa's. "You have a choice. You can leave now and forget everything you saw. But if you stay, you'll have to pay a price. A price you can't afford." Musa swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He wanted to run, to get away from the horror that was now unfolding before him. But he couldn't move. He had been drawn too deep into Yahaya's world, and now he was trapped. The night around them seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer and darker. Musa knew, in that moment, that nothing would ever be the same. Musa stood paralyzed, unable to tear his gaze from Yahaya's glowing eyes. The words echoed in his head, "You'll have to pay a price." He didn't need to ask what the price was, he felt it, deep in his bones, a cold certainty creeping into his soul. Whatever this power was that Yahaya possessed, it was beyond anything Musa had ever known. It was ancient, dark, and unyielding. The market, the jealousy, the petty plans to destroy Yahaya's business, they all felt meaningless now, swallowed by the enormity of what Musa had uncovered. He had crossed a line that he couldn't return from, and Yahya was no longer just the rival butcher he had envied for so long. Yahya was something else, something far more dangerous. Musa's legs felt weak, his heart hammering in his chest as Yahya stepped even closer, the air between them thick with tension. The night seemed to hold its breath, the sounds of the market far away, as though the world had shrunk to just the two of them. "I never wanted this," Musa croaked, his voice barely a whisper. His throat felt tight, as though the weight of the situation was choking him. I didn't know." Yahya's gaze softened, but the darkness behind his eyes remained. "It's too late for that now, Musa. You wanted to destroy me, to take what I've built. But you don't understand what it cost me to get here." Musa swallowed hard, his fear bubbling to the surface. "Please," he begged, his voice shaking. "I won't tell anyone. I'll forget it all, I swear." Yahya stared at him for a long moment, the silence heavy and oppressive. Then, slowly, a sad smile curled at the edge of his lips. "There are no secrets here, Musa. You've seen what you weren't meant to see. That can't be undone." The wind stirred again, cold and sharp, wrapping around Musa like icy fingers. He shivered, a deep dread settling over him as Yahya raised one hand, his fingers moving slowly, almost lazily, through the air. Musa felt it, the pull, the strange power that Yahya had spoken of. It gripped him, tugging at his mind, his body, his very spirit. "No, please, no," Musa stammered, his voice trembling with terror. But the force was too strong, and he was powerless against it. "You tried to take from me, Musa," Yahya said softly. "Now, I take something from you." In a flash, the darkness deepened, wrapping around Musa like a living thing. His vision blurred, the world spinning as his body went numb. He couldn't scream, couldn't fight, as the shadows closed in, suffocating him. His mind whirled, fragments of fear, regret, and sorrow swirling together. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the world fell silent. The next morning, the market woke as it always did. The sun rose over Dandeli, casting golden light over the stalls. The traders bustled about, setting up their wares, calling out to the early customers. But Alhaji Yahya's stall was different that day. As the first buyers approached, they noticed something strange. Musa was there, standing quietly behind Yahya's stall. His eyes were dull, his face expressionless, as if the life had been drained from him. He wasn't selling meat. He wasn't doing anything at all. No one knew what had happened to him, and no one dared ask. Alhaji Yahya greeted his customers with the same warm smile, the same hearty laugh. But if you looked closely, you'd see it, the faintest flicker of something dark in his eyes, a glint of power that hadn't been there before. From that day on, Musa was always there, standing silently by Yahya's side. The other butchers never spoke of what happened. Kura and Sonny avoided Yahya's stall completely, their eyes always flicking nervously toward the spot where Musa now stood, his body present but his soul, somewhere else. The whispers spread, though no one ever dared say it aloud. Alhaji Yahya's success wasn't just luck. He had power, a power that no one understood. And those who crossed him never came back the same. Musa had learned that too late. And now, he would never leave. The market continued as it always had. But the shadows were a little darker, and the wind carried secrets that no one dared to uncover. And Yahya? He smiled. He had won.